Hello and welcome to Ewe Sew You. My name's Zoe and this is my channel all about the crafty bits and pieces I get up to. I knit, I sew, I spin on a drop spindle, I dabble in weaving from time to time, and anything else that takes my crafty fancy. But today we're talking about cross stitch, so grab a brew, put your feet up and let's get started. Welcome back to any returning viewers, and to any new viewers a very warm welcome to you. As I mentioned at the opening to this video, we're talking about cross stitch today. In particular, we're going to look at the materials that you need to get going with cross stitch and get a sort of handle on the basics of the craft. So let me flip the camera around and let's get going. Okay, so let's just start talking about what cross stitch is. Cross stitch is a counted embroidery technique and it's worked over relatively even weave fabric. This is Ada, which is what I use for cross stitch. You can also do cross stitch over linen, and there are ways and means of getting it onto other fabrics, but they require extra stuff, so it's a little bit more experience based for the bravery factor. But you can get washable Ada that you can sew over and then wash out, and you can also use waste fabric, so you attach the Ada to the fabric, stitch over it and then take it out. So it takes a little bit of guts to do, but it's possible. So this is a cross stitch that I got in a kit years ago from a company called Crafty Creatives. They did a subscription craft box. So I don't think you can get this separately anywhere. It's part of a cushion kit. I've just not made it up into the cushion yet. So this is a little owl chap. Came from a kit that came with the pattern and the fabric and all the threads that you needed. So I'm not going to show you the entire pattern because it was one that I paid for, but the pattern looks like this. This is just part of it. So it's on graph paper and it's got symbols representing all the different colours. So this is a relatively simple chart. You can also sometimes get charts where the squares are in the colours that you need, particularly on very, very simple cross stitch patterns. But that's kind of what you're expecting to see, is some sort of gridded reference, the fabric and the threads that you need. You can also get cross stitch kits that are printed onto the fabric rather than giving you a chart. This one, for instance, if I just frame it up there, this is a DMC pattern that I'm working on, and although the pattern did come with printouts of the pattern itself on gridded paper. If I just turn it around the right way up, that's probably going to help. The actual pattern itself that you're following is the one that's printed on the fabric. The charts that came with it are more of a guideline than an actual pattern as such. So I'm just literally covering up all the different coloured bits. So I've already covered up the blues on this side and on the bodice. I've still got some of the blues left to do on this side, and then the pinks and yellowy greens for the flowers. So this one's not far off being done. And a lot of beginner patterns, beginner kits, you may well see them printed onto the fabric. So this is on Ada, as I say, it's what I generally use. It's an even weave fabric, but it's got these regular holes in it. And when I was in primary school, we used to do embroidery on something called Binker, which is a larger version of Ada. So the holes were bigger, the weave was bigger, so so that children can find the holes more easily. Ada comes in a variety of different sizes, so you're looking for the count number. So you have like 14 count, 16 count, 18 count, 24 count, that kind of thing. And that's the number of holes per inch that you can get. So the higher the number, the finer the fabric. So on the background here, so I've got some very fine fabric here. I generally work at sort of 18 to 24 these days, but I have obviously worked in the larger sizes back in the day. I've been doing cross stitch since I was quite small. My mum was a cross stitcher, or still is, I imagine, when the mood takes her. So my sister and I both took up cross stitch quite early on. When I went to secondary school, I actually had a pencil case that I'd made. I'd sewn the fabric and I had a little strip of Ada across the front with cross-stitched girls on. So yeah, so it is something that is a good introductory craft for kids, but it can get incredibly detailed as you develop. So to give you a sense of how a more complicated pattern looks, I've uploaded a photo of myself when I was like 4 into one of these online pattern generator bits of kit. I used one called Stitchboard, but there's loads around. So at the top you've got some information about the pattern. In this particular one it tells you the size that it's going to come out on various different counts of fabric. You don't always get that in a pattern. And then it's got an image of what the finished project would look like. It's slightly pixelated because that's how cross stitch works. Then you've got a list of all the different fabric, all the different colours that you'd need. So you've got this is a DMC palette, so it's got the DMC number, the colour that it's going to appear, and the symbol that it's going to be represented in the chart. So colour, symbol, number, and then how much thread you're going to need, and the name of the colour itself. So you've got the details of threads that you'll need. This being quite a detailed pattern goes on for a while. Now this would be a full coverage pattern, so I'll just give you an example of a page. So that's one page here. So it's got a lot going on. Full coverage is just one type of cross stitch that you can get. So of course a full coverage pattern like this can look quite daunting. You are going to want some way of marking off which stitches you've done. I tend to use a highlighter. I used to use a pencil and colour in the squares, but I find a highlighter works better for me these days. You'll notice that the paper is split up into these squares. So they're usually 10 by 10, so that gives you a good idea of where you're at. And there's a couple of different ways of doing cross stitch. It's kind of your own sort of preference in terms of colour management. So you can work a 10 by 10 square at a time, which I would recommend for full coverage projects. So you work all the colours in that block before moving on to the next one, and you'll work a page at a time. This pattern has got like 9 pages, and so by working a block at a time across the pattern, logically you're going to be able to manage where you're at and keep track of where you're going. Something more simple like this one, you can work in the same way if you wish, or you can work all the same colours in one go, which is what I would do. So I would work all of the foot here, it's all in the same colour in one go, and then move on to the next colour as I work around. So something like this I would start probably in the middle of the pattern. Something like this I would probably start in the top left corner because I'm right-handed. If I was left-handed I'd probably start in the top right corner, just for ease of working. On this pattern you can see there's a heavier outline line going on. That would be in backstitch, and each full square represents one cross stitch. If it was a half square, it'd be a half cross stitch. So if we just think about the anatomy of a cross stitch to begin with. So you've got your fabric, which is made up of holes in a grid pattern. This is not very even, but you'll get the idea. So with the cross stitch, you're going to come up through one and down through the next one, up through another one, and make an X. That's your basic cross stitch. If you're doing a row, you're going to do your underneath slants. I'll just do another one there. Your underneath slants first before coming back to go all the way across. That's a row in the same colour. So if you're doing individual colour stitches in one colour, you do them this way, and in a row that way. So all of these threads are going to be coming through the same holes. So you need to think about how many strands of thread you're using for your project. So if you've got a very fine fabric, you're probably going to want to be using 1 or 2 threads. Larger, like binker type fabric, you can use the whole 6 strands of the thread, but I generally use 2 and then 1 for the back stitch. For most fabrics, if I was working with something very, very fine, I would be thinking about 1 strand of thread per stitch, per colour, for each X that I'm making on the page. So that's your basic cross stitch, your whole cross stitch. So let's have a go. Okay, so here are your basic supplies for cross stitch. I'm assuming that you don't have a hoop or a frame of any kind. So we're going to do some cross stitch in hand. I've just got a little scrap of Ada here that we're going to use today because I haven't got a project on the go for this particular fabric, so it's not a large piece of fabric. We're just going to demonstrate the basic stitch for the time being. So you need your fabric. If you have got a hoop or a frame and you want to put it in there, by all means do. Just obviously make sure that your fabric is cut slightly larger than the hoop so that you can clip it in properly. You're going to need 2 to 3 inches of spare fabric around the outside of any pattern that you're stitching up so that you've got enough fabric to frame it with. So bear that in mind when you're cutting out your fabric if you're working from a pattern rather than a kit. If you're working from a kit, they'll provide you with everything that you need. So you also need some thread. So thread comes in skeins like this. This is an anchor skein. I always used to use anchor threads, so I still have some left over. I'm using more DMC these days, just because I am, no real reason. DMC seems to be a little bit easier to get hold of than anchor. It seems to be a little bit more popular in the States than anchor, but they are two just brands of thread. It comes with 6 strands on it. I also store my thread like this, so this is thread that I wind up onto a bobbin for a project. So this is a DMC one, and I've marked which brand it is and the colour of it, and then I store them in colour order. So that's that. The holes are quite useful if you're somebody who likes to have things on those ring clip things, so you can store the colours for a project that way. And you're also going to need a pair of sharp scissors for snipping threads and an embroidery needle. You want one that's ideally the eye is not wider than the body of the needle, so you want it to go through the hole evenly in the fabric. I am going to tie a knot in the end of this. It's already threaded up with 2 strands of embroidery cotton. Generally, now that I'm a bit more experienced with cross stitch, I don't always tie a knot in the end. It depends how I'm starting my thread. So I'm just putting the 1 knot in, that should be enough. So because I'm not using a hoop, I'm going to hold my fabric under tension in my left hand. Now with this one I'm going to start somewhere where I'm not actually going to be stitching and pop the thread through until the knot hits the fabric. I'm going to snip that off later on. Then wherever my pattern tells me to start, I'm going to bring my needle up through the bottom left hole of where my cross stitch is going to go and take it down through the bottom right hole. And then to come back up, go through the bottom right and up through the top left. So that's your basic cross stitch, and I don't have to hold the end of my thread at all. I'm just keeping it out of the way of view. So that's a single cross stitch made. So we have our single cross stitch, but you're quite often going to be doing more than 1 stitch at a time. So let's just do a row. If I just find my hole. So up through the bottom left, down through the top right, up through the bottom left, making sure we come through the hole and not the fabric, down through the top right, through the bottom left, down through the top right. So now I can either come back the other direction to complete that row, or if I've got a little block, I can always go up to the top right of the row above, or down to the row below, and down through the bottom left. As long as all my underneath slants are slanting the same direction, we're fine. So now I've got a little block of half done stitches. So I'm going to come through the top left of this one in the top row and down through the bottom right. And then the one next to it, I'm going to do the same. And on the row below, I'm going to come up through the bottom right and down through the top left all the way across. So there's our little group of crosses. So on your basic patterns, you're only going to need whole stitches and back stitch. So the back stitch, you come up through one hole, down through the previous hole, up through the hole after where you started, and back through the previous for however long you need. Usually I'll be doing back stitch in a single strand of embroidery cotton, but that's your back stitch. As you get more experienced, you may start to see cross stitch patterns with fractional stitches. So if you see a triangle on your pattern, you're going to do your first cross, and then depending on which side the right angle of the triangle goes, you come up on that side of your cross, and then you come down right through the middle where the threads of the all on the left thread of the Ada cross, and that's your half stitch. And a quarter stitch would obviously be, if you needed two colours together, you'd have a quarter stitch coming on the other side, so you'd come in through the empty hole and again back through the middle. And you're really not going to need much more in the way of cross stitches. You'll need a French knot occasionally. You might want to add beads to things, but these are your basic core cross stitch stitches. So I hope you found that useful and interesting, and if you've enjoyed spending time in my company, I put a video up every weekend, so do the stuff down below to join me next time. But until then, happy crafting and bye bye for now.